Nothing else in the world gets my anxiety going more than conflict. I hate conflict. If I am in active conflict with someone I care about, I am not functional. I can't focus, I can't sleep, I can't really eat. It just feels awful and it's like the worst thing ever. So I don't think it comes as a surprise that my tendency when it comes to conflict is to avoid it at all costs, even if this means pretending that something that bothered me didn't actually bother me and moving on and pretending that nothing happened. This really felt like the best choice because I thought that if I did bring up an issue with someone that they would get mad at me or it'll make things worse or it'll ruin the relationship. Now, I was achieving my goal and no one was getting mad at me and I wasn't losing relationships, but that did not necessarily mean that I was having better relationships. And in fact, it was the opposite. By avoiding conflict at all costs, I was not only hurting my relationships, I was also hurting myself. I would feel a lot of resentment, and that resentment would come out in other ways. I would withdraw, I would get critical, or worst of all, I would go and talk to someone else about an issue I had with someone instead of just addressing it with the person themselves. And in the process, this would just cause a bunch of other issues. I was only able to realize this in hindsight that by not addressing conflicts externally, I was creating conflict internally. And that internal conflict came out in indirect ways that were also not helping my relationships. And I learned the hard way that avoiding hard conversations at all costs is not a good way to approach relationships either. I think I subconsciously hoped that issues would just go away on their own if they were left long enough, but they just got bigger, and I could have saved myself so many problems down the line if I had just addressed issues as they came up instead of pretending that they didn't bother me. I knew that I had to make a change and I had to learn how to approach conflict because avoiding it was not working for me anymore. And it has taken me a lot of real life experience learning about conflict through books and podcasts and therapy to learn how to not be deathly afraid of conflict and instead approach it and handle it well. And honestly, I never thought that I would be at a point where I'm at today where I even feel, dare I say, confident approaching conflict, and where I would much rather have conflict than to have resentment. So I wanted to make this video for all of my fellow conflict averse people out there, and I wanted to share with you everything that I've learned to help me overcome my fear of conflict. There are two main things that I learned. First, I learned to reframe conflict in my mind from something scary to something that can be positive. And second, I learned the essential communication skills to handle conflict well. And we are going to be thoroughly diving into both of these things today. First, let's start with the reframe. There are 3 things that I had to learn about conflict to help me stop avoiding it and instead approach it. And those 3 things are that conflict is normal, positive, and necessary. I know you might be looking at me like I'm from another planet right now, but let me explain. Now, if you're conflict averse like me, you probably also have this narrative that conflict is bad. Conflict means that we're having problems and that the relationship has gone bad. Conflict is bad felt as true to me as the sky is blue. Like, it just felt like a truth of the universe. Until I listened to a podcast with doctors John and Julie Gottman. If you don't know who they are, please look them up. Their content will completely change your life. They are like the world's leading experts on how to make your relationships the best they can be. And the Gottmans really emphasize that conflict doesn't mean that something is wrong with your relationship. It just means that you guys have encountered an organic disruption in your relationship and that this is completely normal and to be expected. Conflict happens in all relationships, including the ones that are the healthiest and most loving. And the only difference between a relationship that is healthy and loving and one that isn't the presence or absence of conflict, it's how the conflict is handled. And if the conflict is handled well, it can actually strengthen our relationships and lead to even more connection than before the conflict came up. And this is because through the process of working things through, we would have learned so much about each other that we couldn't have learned any other way. And if the conflict is handled well, we'll probably also come out of it with more trust and feeling more secure in the relationship, because we would have learned that we can bring up issues and it doesn't have to lead to the end of the relationship. Like, we can work things through together and make things even better. So if we frame conflict this way, we can see that conflict is almost necessary because it keeps things moving and prevents things from stagnating. We need a little bit of conflict sprinkled in every now and then if we want to keep our relationships healthy and growing. Now, the Gottmans also emphasize that because conflict is inevitable and it can be positive and necessary, that means that we all need to be learning the skills to handle conflict well. This is an absolutely essential skill. We all have a responsibility to be learning these skills if we want to have healthy, lasting relationships with the people that are most important to us. Now, sadly, a lot of us don't have the skills to handle conflict well. And this actually might be another reason why we avoid conflict, because we just don't know what to do with it. And this might be because a lot of us didn't come from families where people modeled to us how to handle conflict well. I know I definitely did not have this, but not to worry. There is still hope, because conflict is a learned skill, and it's a skill that can be learned at any time. And that brings us to the second part of this video. We're going to be going through the essential communication skills that we all need to handle conflict well. When I first learned about these skills, it was completely life-changing for me, because it made me realize that conflict doesn't have to be a heated argument where we're attacking each other and trying to prove why we're right and they're wrong. It can be a calm and loving conversation. And here's how we can do that. The first skill is to avoid what the Gottmans call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. These are 4 different communication styles that are extremely harmful to relationships, and they just add fuel to the fire in a conflict. The first horseman is criticism. Criticism happens when you verbally attack the other person's personality or character. And a lot of the time, criticism starts with you. You always, or you never. And when someone gets criticized, usually their response is defensiveness, which is the second horseman. Defensiveness is when you victimize yourself in an attempt to ward off a perceived attack. It's a way of deflecting the blame onto the other person and saying that the problem is you, not me. The third horseman is contempt. Statements made with the intention of insulting or psychologically wounding the other person. This includes sarcasm, hostility, name-calling, and mockery. And according to the Gottmans, contempt is the #1 predictor of divorce. It is poison to relationships. And the fourth horseman is stonewalling. Stonewalling is when someone completely disengages and stops responding, essentially building a stone wall between them and the other person, and they might tune out or act busy or pretend that the other person isn't there. And this often happens when someone is feeling too overwhelmed to continue the conversation, and so they just shut down and completely emotionally withdraw. Now, if any of those 4 horsemen come out in a conflict, they're just gonna escalate things further, so we should avoid them at all costs. And if we ever find ourselves wanting to employ one of those 4 horsemen, the Gottmans recommend that instead of acting on that instinct, we should instead take a break. Our brains perceive conflict as a threat, just like it would perceive a charging grizzly bear as a threat. And when we perceive a threat, whether it's a conflict or a grizzly bear, our body's reaction is the same. It immediately shifts into survival mode, and this is our body's fight or flight response. When we are in fight or flight, our amygdala, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for fear and anxiety, releases a cascade of stress hormones into our body, and this causes a lot of physical changes. Our muscles tighten, our heart starts racing, we might start sweating, and our breathing might start getting really shallow. And at the same time, our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for decision making, problem solving, emotion regulation, and empathy, shuts off. Now, it's really convenient that our bodies do this if we're trying to save ourselves from a grizzly bear. It's not so convenient though when we're trying to resolve a conflict with someone that we care about. Because if we are arguing with someone when we're in this state, we're just gonna fall into our default patterns. Either we'll have a fight response and say things we don't mean, or we'll have a flight response and don't say things that we mean. Either way, we're not going to have very good control over ourselves. We're not going to be able to listen or take in any new information. We're going to be seeing things from a very limited point of view, and we're not going to be able to articulate our point of view very well. So if we find ourselves in this state or falling into our defaults, the best thing we can do is stop. Don't make any sudden moves. Don't continue the conversation any further, and instead take a break. No conflict is so important that it needs to be addressed right away. And probably you shouldn't be trying to address things right away because it's just going to make things worse. Now, to be able to put this skill into practice, it's going to be really important that we know the signals in our body that are telling us we're going into survival mode. And these signals might vary a bit from person to person. So some people might get really hot. Others might get really cold. Some people might start sweating or shaking or find it hard to breathe. And so to identify our unique body signals, I find it helpful to think back to a conflict that we had with someone we cared about in the past and think about what was going on in our body in that moment. Personally, I know that when I'm in survival mode, I completely freeze. I feel like I can't move and I go inward. My palms get all cold and sweaty and my ears start ringing, and then the other person starts sounding like they're an adult from Charlie Brown, and I feel like I look like a deer in the headlights. Now, something else that the Gottmans also recommend is that when you call for this break, say when you're gonna come back to revisit the issue. So that way the other person doesn't feel like you're just checking out and abandoning them. So saying something along the lines of, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm feeling overwhelmed right now and I need to take some time. Is it okay if we come back and revisit this in 3 hours? And during these 3 hours, the Gottmans recommend doing something to shift out of survival mode and calm our nervous system. So doing some deep breathing or yoga or going for a walk. And once we've done our soothing activity and we've calmed down, that's when we can access the rational thinking part of our brain again, and that's when we can finally properly process this conflict on our own. When I'm processing a conflict on my own, I find it really helpful to ask myself these 3 questions. What feelings are coming up for me in this conflict? Am I feeling hurt, sad, scared? What needs of mine aren't getting met that contributed to this conflict? Am I not getting the quality time that I need? Am I not hearing from the other person as often as I need? And what is my desired outcome with this conflict? Do I want to resolve the issue? Do I want to strengthen the relationship? Do I want to create new patterns? And having asked myself these questions on my own, I find it a lot easier to be able to articulate myself when I do go back and revisit the issue with the person. Now, when we do return, this is where the next communication skill comes in, which is to lead with an intention of resolving the issue and repairing the relationship. So starting with something like, I really want to work through things with you because I don't want anything to get in between us because I really value you and I care a lot about our relationship. And making this known right off the bat to someone that you do care and you do want to work through things is gonna help them to feel safe to put their guard down so that you can both come into this conversation with more openness. Okay, so now that we've led with our intention to repair the relationship, now it's time to share our side of the story. And this is where the next skill comes in, which is to avoid discussing the other person's actions and instead stick to talking about our feelings. So this is gonna involve refraining from starting sentences with you and instead starting sentences with I. We love our I statements. Things like, I felt, insert feeling here. I noticed, insert observation here. The story I told myself was. insert my made up story here. This skill is all about framing. The way we frame our point of view is everything. It can make the difference between the other person feeling attacked and the conflict getting worse, and the other person being understanding and the conflict getting resolved. So for example, let's say that I have a partner and we haven't seen each other in a while, and when we do finally see each other, they take a nap for 2 hours, and this really upsets me. I could frame my point of view to them as, you are so rude and inconsiderate, and you clearly don't care about spending any time with me. Or I could frame it as, I felt hurt because I was really looking forward to spending time with you, and when you fell asleep for 2 hours, the story I started telling myself was that you don't care about spending time with me, and then that made me feel scared because I was worried that I was losing you. Two very different ways of framing the same situation, and clearly the second one is going to be much more conducive to having open and authentic and vulnerable conversation with my partner, which will hopefully lead to a stronger connection between us. Now, the reason why it's best to stick to talking about our feelings and avoid talking about the other person's behavior is because sometimes the way we interpret someone else's behavior may not be true, whereas our feelings are always true. So for example, it may not be true that my partner doesn't care about spending time with me, but what is true is that I felt hurt. That is irrefutable. No one can negate that. Now, when we are expressing our feelings, I have learned to stick to only expressing feeling hurt or scared, because these are the two primary underlying emotions that we're feeling in any conflict. We could also be feeling angry or annoyed or frustrated, but even so, the underlying feeling underneath all of those are hurt and scared. And so I would refrain from expressing anger or frustration because those are more likely to inflame the other person, whereas they're much more likely to be open and accepting and understanding of us if we stick to expressing feeling hurt or scared. Okay, so we've shared our side of the story. Now it's time to hand the mic over to the other person and give them the time and space that they need to share their side of the story. This is our cue to shut up. We're not interrupting them. We're not jumping in to explain why they interpreted something wrong. We are just being curious about what they have to say. That's it. There are always two viewpoints in any conflict, and they're probably not going to be the same. That's why we're having a conflict to begin with. And a lot of the times we're convinced that our viewpoint is objective reality, when actually it's not. There are so many ways that we can interpret any single event, and even if the other person's interpretation of the event is different from ours and we disagree with it, both viewpoints are still valid and right. And when we understand this, that's going to help us to come from a place of curiosity when we're hearing the other person out. Our goal here is just to understand their viewpoint. It's not to prove why their viewpoint is wrong and ours is right, because both are right. And when they're done communicating their side, there are two really important things that we can do. Number one, offer a summary of what they said, and starting with something like, what I'm hearing is, or it sounds like. And number two, offer validation. I get you, I hear you, I can see how you would have felt that way, and that's going to help the other person to feel heard and understood. And hearing heard and understood is how we're going to come out of this conflict stronger than when we started. The next skill for handling conflict is to take responsibility and apologize. This is the antidote to defensiveness, which we've learned now is one of the 4 horsemen and should be avoided because it's just going to make things worse. Conflict is always a two-way street, and both parties are both contributing to the conflict in some way. And if we ever want to work through this conflict and grow from it, we have to take responsibility for our side of the street and accept what the other person is saying and own up to the ways that we might have upset them. It doesn't matter if we don't agree with the reason that they're upset. It doesn't matter if the thing we said or did was interpreted differently than the way it was intended. All that matters here is that the other person feels hurt, and we need to take accountability and offer a genuine apology for that. Now, a lot of us struggle with this because the ego is involved, and the ego never wants to be wrong. It's gonna protect us from ever being wrong by deflecting and blaming. But if we're deflecting and blaming, we're not growing from this experience, we're not becoming better people because of it, and our relationship is definitely not improving and evolving either. And so next time you find your ego is getting in the way when you're in a conflict, I really invite you to ask yourself, what's more important to you, being right or this relationship? Okay, so everything is now on the table. We've heard each other out. We've both apologized for our respective sides of the street. And now we have made it to the final conflict resolution skill. So the Gottmans recommend wrapping up a conflict conversation by identifying one thing that we can do differently and one thing that the other person can do differently to prevent this issue from happening again. And this is going to involve asking for our needs. So saying something like, what I need is, insert need here. So next time this happens, would you be willing to insert how to meet this need here? So if we're going back to the example of being upset because our partner took a nap during our time together after not seeing each other for a while, we can say something like, what I need is reassurance from you that you do care about spending quality time with me. So next time you need to take a nap during our time together, can you provide me with that reassurance? Can you tell me that you do care about spending quality time with me and that you're going to be much more able to be present with me if you take a nap first? So this is the framework, and these are the communication skills for healthy, productive conflict. You might want to send this video to someone that you're in conflict with. And if the other person cares as much about the relationship and making things work as you do, then these skills are going to set us up for success to turn those conflicts into opportunities for growth and for strengthening the relationship. All right, that is everything that I have learned about conflict and how to handle it as someone who hates conflict. I really hope that this helps you not only to have better relationships, but also to just feel better yourself, because living with resentment because you're too afraid to bring up an issue is not fun either. And in fact, at this point, we should take feeling resentful as a sign that we should probably be having a conversation. And now we have the skills to have that conversation. Learning these skills has been one of the hardest things I have ever done, but it has also been one of the most worthwhile because my relationships are so much healthier and happier now, and I'm at a point now where I see that showing up and bringing up conflict is part of being good to the people that we care about the most. It shows that we care. If we didn't care, we wouldn't even bother having this hard conversation with them. And so I understand now that being a good friend or partner or daughter or sister means showing up and bringing up conflict. So I wish you the best of luck. You got this. Trust me, if I can learn how to overcome conflict avoidance and have hard conversations, you can do it too. I promise. As always, I hope you're staying well, and I will see you next time. Bye.